Hi everybody. This week we begin a graphic novel adaptation of Kindred. So as a way of getting into that, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the theory behind adaptations and the theory that critics use when they think about and analyze adaptations of literary works. So the first question we need to consider is, what is an adaptation? And in her book on adaptation theory, Linda Hutcheon describes adaptations as, quote, repetition, but repetition without replication. And what she means by that is that adaptations repeat the same story points, the same characters, maybe the same themes, but they do that without necessarily replicating the original work. So they do that while creating a new literary work or a new work of art that can stand on its own and that has some sort of independent character and that is fresh and new and interesting in some kind of way. So basically it's repetition, so it has similar characters, similar story points, but it's not replication. So it has some sort of individuality, some sort of creativity to it, something that's new and fresh. So beyond that, at a more sort of practical level, an adaptation is a work of literature, art, film, or any other media that represents another work. And the most common forms of adaptations that you're probably most familiar with are film adaptations of books. So, for example, the Harry Potter movie series, or film adaptations of comic books, like all the Marvel movies and other movie series that are based on these original comic books. However, there's not just film adaptations out there. So writers and artists adapt literary works into a wide range of genres and mediums, including plays, musicals, music videos, video games, graphic novels, and even other novels. So basically, if there is a genre out there, there has been some sort of adaptation that has been created in that genre. So in this class, we will be reading a graphic novel adaptation of the book Kindred. And as we do this, we need to be thinking about how we should approach these adaptations. And one common way that people approach adaptations is through the lens of fidelity criticism. And fidelity criticism is basically sort of a fancy way of saying that the person who's looking at the adaptation is focused on how faithfully the adaptation replicates the other text. So in other words, this means that the person is asking, how well does it follow the book? Or how well does it follow the comic book? Or how well does it follow, whatever that sort of original work was. So thinking in terms of how faithfully it replicates that original text. However, that's not the only way to think about adaptations. And Linda Hutcheon, who we met just a few minutes ago, proposes a different way to evaluate adaptations. And this is a quote from her book that I'll go ahead and read in full. She says, like classical imitation, adaptation is also not slavish copying. It is the process of making the adapted material one's own. In both, the novelty is in what one does with the text. Perhaps one way to think about unsuccessful adaptations is not in terms of fidelity to a prior text, but in terms of a lack of creativity and skill to make the text one's own and thus autonomous. So here she's basically sort of fleshing out that idea that she presented earlier, that we shouldn't be thinking about necessarily how well does it replicate the original material, but rather how well the person who's adapting it, the writer, the artist, the creator, how well the adapter is making that original work their own and representing it in a way that's new and interesting and fresh while still having some relation to that prior work. So at this point, I'm going to begin by presenting some questions that we can use when we're approaching graphic novel adaptations, including the adaptation of Kindred that we're going to be reading this week. So these are questions that don't necessarily ask how well does it replicate or copy what's been done, but other ask questions about sort of how is it doing that work of representing it, and what is it bringing out in representing that work, and what is it sort of adding, or what sort of freshness or what things of interest is it maybe even adding to the work. So the first set of questions I'm going to talk about are questions about sort of the genre or the medium, so questions that get at sort of the unique aspects of graphic novels. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, graphic novels and comic books are unique in that they are sort of sequential pieces of art. So we have, images that are sort of put in a row and together those tell a kind of narrative or story. And they draw on images, so on pictures and illustrations, but they also draw on text in a lot of different kinds of ways. So these questions have to do with that sort of unique aspect of the graphic novel and comics. So the first question is, how does the author and artist use the unique features of graphic novels? So this would be things like illustrations, captions, sound effects, speech bubbles, other things, to convey sequences of events, especially events that occurred in the original novel. So this is a how question, right? How does it use these things that are unique to the comic book and the graphic novel form to tell a sort of similar story? The next question is also a how question. How does the author and artist use unique features of graphic novels? Again, features like illustrations, captions, sound effects, speech bubbles, etc., to convey characters' thoughts and feelings, especially those that happened in the original novel. So in a novel, we usually know characters are thinking or feeling because they tell us, because there's a narrator who's telling us these things, or we're getting cues from a narrator. But graphic novels are put together a little bit differently. So how is the author and the artist, how are they using these features of the graphic novel to convey characters' thoughts and feelings? And then finally, how does the author and artist use unique features of the graphic novel? Again, illustrations, captions, sound effects, speech bubbles, etc., to convey characters' behavior, especially behavior that occurred in the original novel. This is similar to the first question, but it's different in that it's thinking about specifically, what is it the characters are doing in the situation. The characters are sort of treating each other, how the characters are behaving. So it's sort of related to that question of sort of the events, but also related to that question of, characters' thoughts and feelings, and also gets at characters' personalities as well. All right, and then the next set of questions we're going to talk about are questions about adaptation more broadly. And these are questions that we could also ask about other kinds of adaptations as well. So the first question gets at the evolution of characters, personalities, and perspectives. How does a graphic novel, or we could also apply this to other forms of adaptation, convey the evolution of characters' personalities and perspectives? Are characters largely the same, or are some aspects of their personalities or development altered or downplayed? So first we have this question of how. So if we think back to the novel, right, there's ways in which Rufus's character is sort of his evolution as a character is conveyed throughout the novel. We see ways in which Kevin's character and changes in his character are conveyed throughout the novel. So how does the graphic novel convey that evolution of the characters, that development of the characters? And then along with that, are they the same, or is the graphic novel presenting a different sort of perspective on these characters, or a slightly different take on these characters' evolution? And if so, how? The second question has to do with theme. What themes does the graphic novel develop? Does it develop the same themes in the same way as the original novel, or does it develop some themes differently? Does it eliminate or downplay some themes from the original novel, or does it introduce new themes? So this question is basically asking you to think, first of all, just what themes are happening in this graphic novel? Are they the same as happened in the novel? And if so, how are they being developed? Or is there something different about the way that themes are being developed in the graphic novel, or new themes that are being developed, or themes that are being left out that were in the original novel? And then the last question has to do with this question of interpretation. And this is actually one of the questions I think is the most interesting question to ask about adaptations. So how does the graphic novel interpret events and characters from the original novel? And some questions that go along with this would be like, how does it visually present characters? How does it visually present places and events? So what are the effects of these choices? So sometimes novels will give us really detailed descriptions of characters, but sometimes it won't. Sometimes a lot of that is left up to us as readers and up to our imagination, and we bring our own experiences to these characters when we're imagining them. But in a graphic novel, we have an artist who's actually doing that imagining and doing that interpreting for us, which makes it a little bit different from a traditional novel. So what choices are they making? What does Dana look like? What does Kevin look like? What does Alice look like? What does Sarah look like? What do these characters look like? And what are those illustrations, how do they change or enrich or alter the perception of characters? Or what vision of the characters does it present that's maybe different from our own vision of the characters? Or the setting. How is this sort of setting being developed? There's lots of places where the setting isn't necessarily in a lot of detail. So how is that setting being presented in the illustrations? And how does that affect the novel and affect the development of characters and the developments of themes? So these are some questions to get you started as we think about adaptations, and specifically about the graphic novel, Adaptation of Kindred. And in your journal for this week, we're actually going to be looking at some of these questions in detail, and you're going to be looking at a sort of a scene from the graphic novel and applying and asking some of these questions of that scene. So I'm going to look forward to see what you have to say about that. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and let me know.